What is the best way to worship? My way. Yeah. And I'm laughing at that because this is what most churches would say. Most groups say, well, our way is the best way. And in many cases, they'll say our way is the only way. And in this path, of course, we understand that that's not exactly true. Or is it? The way that is best for us is the way that works for us. So our way is the best way. But how do we find out what our best way is? This is the thing, is that if you grow up in a religious culture and a set of religious beliefs, so then you grow up believing those things. But not everybody grows up believing the same things that their parents and their family believe. And most religions do have a point at which you have to choose to confirm that yes, you do in fact believe what the rest of the people in your religion believe. But it's important to understand that if we want to worship God, we have to find a way to worship God in a way that is meaningful to us. We can't just do it because others are doing it that way. We can't do it just because we grow up doing it that way. And we have to very deeply understand what it is that we're actually trying to do. When we pray on our path, we pray to our line of masters, but then we say, and to the saints of all religions. And we're saying that all religions have created saints. A saint, if you define a saint as someone who knows God, who has practiced their path to the point where they've had the direct experience of God's presence through their path, they become a saint. So their way of worship has worked for them. But how do we find our way of worship? And this is one of the very important understandings of the spiritual life is that we need to find our spiritual family. The group of people, the vibrational essence, the way of worship that feels like home to us. And you may find that in the way that you grow up, but you may not. I grew up in a family that had, we were socially Jewish, but not practicing in any way. So what that told me, what my parents were teaching me, is that we believe this, but it's not important because we don't do it. So, but if your parents practice what they preach, if they practice what, then you say, well, it seems to be working for them. Maybe it can work for me. And many people come onto the path and they shop around and go, well, let me try this, let me try that, which is perfectly fine. It's a natural thing, the circumstance is to seek greater understanding of what's even possible. But there's a certain point at which we have to recognize that if we want to worship, we have to actively participate. The definition of worship is that we are actively participating in the process or the activity of connecting to God, connecting to Spirit, in whatever form that we feel inspired to connect to. Krishna says in the Gita, whatever form you worship, that's the form that I come. So if you worship God as outward success, then you will attain outward success. If you worship God as money, and let's face it, There's a lot of people who bow to the altar of money and capitalistic, materialistic lifestyle. And there are some people who worship alcohol and recreational drugs. They give their lives to it. They sacrifice themselves to these things. That's worship. Worship is when you give yourself completely to something. It's not going into a room that has pictures or murtis. That's not worship. That's going to, you could say it's going to the temple. But the temple doesn't become the temple until, as it was saying in the reading, until it's become interiorized. Until you have taken it into and upon your own self to actively participate. And on ever deeper and deeper levels. We don't expect that someone who's new to anything would be really good at it. But if we have perfected worship, we have communed with God. And there's countless stories of saints who, in the act of worship, were taken up into an ecstatic state. And then worship is transformed from seeking to communing. And this is the essential difference between the scientific yogic approach and religious beliefs that think that you can buy your way into a higher experience by giving enough money to the temple or by paying a pujari to say mantras. Yes, you can get some things through that, but you won't get communion. You won't get true worship. Worship is something that we do. Well, it's like meditation. When you begin trying to meditate, that's what you're not meditating, you're trying to meditate. When we begin worship, we're trying to worship. We're trying to commune. But it takes practice, it takes commitment, it takes transformation from the experience of personality consciousness, the little self, to experience of the larger infinite self. Krishna said, surrender to me, give yourself to me. What self was he talking about? Was he saying, okay, I gotta go to the temple from 10 to 11. I'm giving myself? No. I mean, that's something, that's a little bit. What is one of the ways that you know that somebody's really committed to something? They do it. They give it time. They give it their attention. And this is the essential thing that many people don't even do when they show up. Many people come to churches and temples because they're afraid not to. They're afraid that God will be mad at them. They're afraid that their neighbors will think less of them. They may even be in fear of their lives if the neighbors don't see them acting in ways that the neighbors feel that they should be acting. There's many communities that are so small-minded in their understanding of spirituality that they think that they're so right that they should kill others who don't agree with them, who don't see the right as they see it. And yet we know that God's nature is love. That consciousness is so directly opposed to the very purpose of worship. And yet many people have been killed in the name of religion. And this is important to understand, that the prayers and the things that we are given to do by the path that we follow have a certain power because people have practiced them for time, for some amount of time. But they're not really fully empowering, energizing until we give our hearts to them. Many people by rote, they just, whether you're using a mala, you're doing it 108 times, Om Guru or Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, any mantra, or whether you're using, you're a Christian and you use one of the Psalms, or those things do have some power, but they don't fully become active until we give ourselves to it. It's the same with Kriya Yoga. When we practice Kriya Yoga can just be a breathing exercise, or it can be worship. They're not the same, but they can be the same. When we have surrendered our hearts, our being, Jesus said it so beautifully. He said, pray with all your mind, all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. You have to fully give yourself to it. You have to enter into it with 100% of your being, your spirit. You imagine the commitment that it takes to jump out of an airplane, parachuting. And many people who say they want to do it, when they get to the door, they go, oh no, it's too much for them. And bungee jumping, there's all around the world, there's places where people jump off, and they then when they're on the ground, they're going, I can do that. But they get up there, and they're like, oh, and there's been plenty of cases where finally the operator and it used to be years ago when you parachuted for the first time, you could take a course, you go up and you did it by yourself, and if you didn't pull the cord, you died. But I guess some people must have died because they stopped doing that. And I know in America anyway, they require you to go double. You're connected to an experienced instructor. And I've seen videos of these things where you see the person who's doing it for the first time. And there's that moment where the newcomer is at the door, and then the instructor just dives out whether they're ready or not. And you see their eyes go, ah! In the spiritual life, there's this point where we have to tip from, I think I would like to do this, to fully committing ourselves to it. If we want to worship, we have to be fully committed. We've got to give it our attention. You don't want to jump out of an airplane without checking your equipment. And making sure that, the weather's not too rough and that there's a landing area and such. When spiritually speaking, we want to be properly of the right mind and understanding about what it is we're trying to do. And this is really one of the great benefits of the yoga teachings, because we have a very specific understanding that worship takes place on the inside. That commitment is not just getting to the temple, it's getting to the inner temple. It's getting inwardly connected. You can't even get into the temple, the real temple, the inner spine, until you've achieved some level of inner commitment. You've given it a certain amount of time, and you've practiced sufficient technique in order to achieve some level of interiorization and open-hearted connectedness. But we know that there have been saints in all of the major religions, which means that it's not the outward style, but the inner process is the same. You never hear about a story about saints who go find God in nightclubs. They dance their way, Even if you take the whirling dervishes in the Middle East, they go into a very interiorized state of centeredness. They're not outwardly emoting, they're inwardly centering. And that's a very specific and, you might say, unique practice but it's representative, I don't know how we got onto this subject, but of the energy in the spine. And in the spine there is, when the energy rises, a certain circular component to it. And the Jews do this thing, I forget what it's called, but they move their bodies. Unfortunately, they think that by moving the body outwardly, they will be stimulating this inner motion. You don't want that. What you want to do is attain deeper and deeper levels of stillness. And in that stillness, if you experience one of these times when the energy flows and causes some kind of a body reaction, then that's secondary, because then you're in a state of deep stillness. You're not emotioning yourself into worship. Many people think that worship is tied to your emotional commitment, meaning that you should cry for God. There's nothing wrong with crying for God, but it should be rooted in a deep opening of soul awareness, not in a, oh, I'm so sick of being sad. Yeah, you can start there. But the resolution of sadness or hurt or some problem in life is not to basically, like a child, whine and have a crying fit until mother comes and gives you some attention. We want to go to a much deeper level of realizing that our true self is the peace and the joy that we seek. That the place that we're trying to get to is not distant. It's right here within our own selves. When you ask yourself, think back when you're growing up and your impression of God. Well, where is God? You're going to worship God. You've got to find Him to worship Him, right? Where can you worship God? And you've got to go in the temple. You've got to go, because is God in here more than anywhere else? No, but this is an environment where people practice trying to connect, because it's more difficult to do things when you're distracted by other activities. When we go to the temple to worship, we're going to an environment that will support that worship. And that's the main reason we go. And this is the value of spiritual family. When we find that group of people and that style of practice that feels like home to us, it supports our spiritual practice in a way that we feel most comfortable with. And that's why my way is the right way. That's why your way is your right way, because it feels like home to you. And so when we find our spiritual path, when we find our guru, then we were finding an environment that supports our worship of God, not a consciousness of sectarianism, not a consciousness that my group is better than any other group, except it's better for me. And in that we appreciate and are thankful for it and are loyal to the way that's good for us. But we have to recognize that anybody who goes inside and opens their hearts and gives their full attention at the point between the eyebrows and commits themselves 100% to their offering of the little self to the infinite self, and communing with peace and joy and love. That silent, calm presence of the divine that is always there underneath all of the activity of life. We want to worship. We learn to worship in the temple, but where did the Master say that he found God? In his attic meditation room. He didn't say that he found God in the temple. He found God in that time that he committed to communion. That's really what he's saying. He's saying instead of going to play with the other boys, which he loved to do, he would meditate. Instead of going to the family activities, he would meditate. Instead of going to school, he would meditate. Now, you might say, well, bad boy. And most people grow up, even in well-meaning families and communities, that would say that very thing. Say, no, you've got to fulfill your responsibilities to our expectations of the right way to live. But how have they determined that that's the right way to live? What proof do they have? When I was growing up, I saw people who had every outward advantage, but they didn't have any inner advantages. They weren't happy. All of the ways that people lived were not giving them happiness. And if you look at the average person, even a person who goes to temple or to church on a regular basis, according to the style of their path, they're generally not very deeply happy. And I noticed even when I first came to Ananda and found this society of people on this path, everybody was young. I mean, just it's not like Ananda was centuries old. The teachings were, but the style of the Ananda style was new, very fresh. And so, but I came to a group. They've been there 2 or 3 years. That's not really a long time when you consider that it takes a lifetime, really, many lifetimes, to truly transform yourself. And yet what I found was a group of people that were happy all the time. It's really unusual to find an unhappy person at Ananda. I mean, yeah, people have their ups and downs, but it's just really not that common. Because the practice of communion, and you really can equate this in so many ways, not necessarily to hours of meditation. Well, let me put it this way. Worship. Worship isn't just meditation. Worship isn't just coming to satsang. It's the totality of the way we live. We have to realize that worship is what are we thinking about when we're washing the dishes? Worship is, what are we thinking about when we're taking care of the kids? Are we inwardly complaining that they're distracting us from watching our TV show? Or are we fully present in understanding what their needs are, and our hearts are open to serving those needs, and we see that God has put us in this place to do this action at this time, and therefore the peace and joy of God presence is flowing through me in this circumstance. This really is when we learn to worship, or let's take singing. You might go to singing school, music school. You learn the techniques of singing, but then you don't only sing at school. Hopefully you go out and you sing, any opportunity you have in your life. We want to worship 24/7. We want to give ourselves, our mind, give your mind to God. Give your heart to God. Give your soul, your sense of connection to infinite spirit. Give this to your commitment of time and attention and all of your strength, everything that you have. If you want to succeed at anything in life, you must have this concentration and determination. And this is worship. This is the worship that leads to transformation. When we go from, okay, God, I hope you're not mad at me today. I did make a few mistakes. To consciously experiencing ever-expanding horizons of inner peace. Yes, give God your mistakes. But that inner conversation shouldn't be one way. It's not that we go in, we say the mantras, we don't really know if God heard us or not. We hope so, because we paid enough money in the plate when it went around. But that's not worship. Worship is a full commitment to living for to living with God. God living through your consciousness, attuning yourself to, as we describe it, the ray of Yoganandaji's and the masters of self-realization, the ray of their inspiration as it flows into this world. We can ride that wave, that flow of energy to freedom. Freedom from suffering, freedom from all of the limitations that we generally experience. But along the way, we are transformed from trying to worship, trying to love God, to actually loving God. And when we love God, we joy God. we peace God. We calmness God. We hear the Om. We feel the Om God. We commune. We free ourselves. We again, as Krishna said, we fully surrender our little selves. And when we surrender completely, then in that worship state, in that communion state, we experience oneness with God. And this is when we actually can say you're not worshiping until you experience communion. But we're trying to worship. We're drawing our forces together. We're getting better and better at it. We're committing ourselves to it. And at some point, you go from trying to experiencing. And this is the saints of our religions. This is the purpose of worship, is not to go to the outer temple. It's to live 24/7 in the inner temple. And when we practice worship in this inner way, then we will find that all of life changes from the tumultuousness that most people experience to the joy of Ananda. That's our spiritual family. It's called Ananda. It's the family of joy. It's the lifestyle of joy. It's the communion with God's joy. This is worship in all times, in all circumstances. And the more we give ourselves to it, the more we will experience of it. Namaste.